Well, is there any upside to the polar ice caps melting? Putting aside the environmental debate for just a moment, we're going to fast forward a decade and take a closer look at how Arctic ice retreat will affect undersea oil and gas reserves, as well as global shipping routes, and of course, how investors can take advantage. Joining me now from San Francisco is Paul Saffo. Paul is the managing director of Foresight at Discern, which provides research for institutional investors. Paul, such a pleasure to have you on. Let's start right away, really, on the environmental side of this thesis. What is happening in the Arctic? You know, ice has been retreating. The forecasts are sort of all over the place, but I guess the ice has been really retreating in that region at about 8% a year.
Yeah, no, the forecasts are very clear. Over the last 20 years, you've had about a 17% ice retreat up north. So leave aside the politics. The scientific data is there. Whatever the cause anyone may choose, the fact is the ice is retreating. Just last winter, we had the lowest ice levels in December 2010 ever recorded. And in September of last year, for the first time in history, the entire northern sea route across the top of Russia, from Norway all the way to the Bering Strait, was ice-free. And one large transport ship was able to cross it without the aid of an icebreaker.
Okay, and one of the key things that's going on here is, as that happens, this actually opens up the northern sea route, which is going to have a big impact, or could potentially have a big impact, on global trade and access to natural resources. And Paul, we actually have a map here where you can see in red the northern sea route. This is as the ice melts, what could potentially open up, versus the southern route, which is currently taken. And you can see that is significantly longer, the current route, or the southern route, versus this northern sea route.
Yeah, you know, it will be some time before the northern sea route is just an everyday alternative to taking the classic route around the Cape. But the geography is that you're basically shortening a trip from, say, Rotterdam to Shanghai by 40% by going north instead of south.
And this is what I think in your research piece you said it's 40% shorter. What does this mean, and how does this translate into costs and lowering costs for companies that are using that as a shipping route currently?
Well, one ship was able to shorten its sea journey by 15 days last summer compared to going south. To get a sense of it, you may recall that about a year ago we had a Chinese carrier go aground off of Australia on the Great Barrier Reef, and he went aground because he was trying to shorten his trip from Australia to Shanghai by 20 kilometers. So when ship captains are willing to take that kind of risk to just shorten by 20 kilometers, you can imagine how excited people will get when you say you can shorten a trip from 16,000 miles to under 12,000 miles.
Paul, I want to ask you one last question before we take a break here, but let's talk about Russia and why this is so critical for the country.
Well, long term, this is, 50 years, this is about transport from one ocean to another. Short term, this is about unstranding Russian assets. 13% of the world's energy reserves are in the Russian Arctic. You have vast resources in Siberia, the largest nickel mine on the planet. And as the ice retreats, you now have a route for moving Russian resources out of the north to the rest of the world.
But let's talk about the other countries that have vested interests here. China is also a country that could stand to really benefit as they ship and use this particular route. And here's a quote from your research piece from a Chinese academic who said, whoever has control of the Arctic route will control the new passage of world economies and international strategies. A pretty big statement, but the U.S. has real interests as well.
Absolutely. All of the Arctic-touching nations, Norway, Canada, the United States, Greenland in particular, have interests. But then China, of course, because of its need for resources, is important here. China takes a very long view. They're thinking out several decades, but as an indication of the seriousness China takes this, a few years back, a Chinese icebreaker showed up on the shore of the Canadian Arctic out of the blue. Well, China has no frozen shoreline. The only reason they built an icebreaker was to explore the Arctic.
Paul, we talked about as the ice retreats that shipping would open up, but there are other industries that are also likely to benefit. You did mention that there is a lot of resources, natural resources, that have not been yet mined in this area.
Sure. Make no mistake, in the short term, opening up of the Northern Sea Route is a story that's almost entirely about moving stranded Russian natural resources to the rest of the world. So, this is all about rebuilding infrastructure that's been neglected up there. The Russians are doing a lot of work in Murmansk and talking about infrastructure all along the Northern Sea Route. So it's infrastructure, it's resources, and other assets.
And very quickly, for investors looking to take advantage today, this is very much a long-term story and looking forward, but you recommend playing the ruble. That would be the quickest and, I guess, safest way to kind of take advantage now.
Sure. Now, and qualifies, this is a scary space. Lurking behind all this is issues of Russian corruption. But the ruble plays a straightforward one. They're also with international partners working with Russian companies. And more Russian companies are coming on the market, though that's very problematic. Sovcomflot, the largest Russian shipping company, announced that it was going to put half of the government-owned shares on the market in the next 2 years. But of course, a UK court just handed down a decision around corruption that's going to delay that. So this is white-knuckled space, but important opportunities because Russia's a resource-based economy and it has to move those resources.
All right. But as you said, a lot of risks there. Thank you so much, Paul. We'd love to have you back. That was Paul Saffo, Managing Director of Foresight at Discern Analytics.